What's up, and welcome to another episode of 52 Hertz, the Lonely World podcast. I'm your host, Petrice Jones. Today, my guest is Kelsey Halling. Kelsey is the head of partnerships at First Mile, an organization that disrupts the recycling industry by bringing transparency to the first mile of the recycling supply chain.
To look at the plastic problem right now, recycling isn't going to get us out of the mess we've dug ourselves into. However, there are also many parts of the world where you can't yet cut out plastic.
This first mile is where you'll find some of the people most affected by the plastic crisis.
I think that sometimes sustainability can focus almost exclusively on the environmental. And if you're not including people as part of this process, then it's going to be difficult to really change things.
Working with people on the ground in countries like Haiti, Honduras, and Taiwan, First Mile creates dignified job opportunities. Local communities transform plastic bottles into recycled materials used by some of the world's most recognizable brands: HP, Reebok, Timberland, and Converse, just to name a few. Welcome to 52 Hertz, the Lonely World podcast. But first, some good news from around the reef. Local fishermen have teamed up with top chefs from around the country to transform trash fish into treasure. Trash fish, a fish species that are traditionally less known and underutilized in the restaurant industry, are getting a makeover thanks to a community-supported fishery that could. As part of the growing Know Your Fisherman movement, companies like Dr. Dish help marine life ecosystems recover from devastating effects of overfishing caused by commercial fisheries. And this is how it works. Restaurants agree to buy a certain amount of fish fresh from Dr. Dish, but they don't get to choose that type of fish. Small-scale local fishermen and nature do. Which means sometimes getting fish that we're not used to seeing on a fine dining menu, like sheepshead, shovel-nosed guitarfish, and anchovies. This approach helps the seafood dinners taste to better align with their values. Trash fish equals treasure. Trash fish. Trash fish. So Kelsey, welcome to the show and thank you for being here.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
No, of course. So I would love it if you just tell us a little bit about First Mile and what it is that you do there.
We chose the name First Mile because it refers to the part of the supply chain that we are most involved with. So the first mile of the supply chain, meaning where the actual bottles are being picked up and collected. And in most supply chains, when you start talking about where that material is coming from, it will either be at a country level or at the recycling facility. There is a whole couple of steps before then, which we refer to as the first mile, before the material makes its way to a recycling facility. So by being able to offer insight and data from this part of the supply chain that is generally a black box of information, we think that we can bring tremendous value to brands and also help them tell really engaging stories to their consumers about the impact that they're having by using this material. And then, of course, this is also where the most vulnerable populations are working, and so the most intervention is needed.
There's a lot of recycling supply chain conversations, and like you said, the typical focus is on the environmental impacts rather than the human side of things. So I'd love you to describe your perception of what climate justice means.
That's a great question. One of the phrases that we say often is, there will be no environmental justice without social justice. Really understanding how those two go so well hand in hand, I think, is key. And sometimes sustainability can focus almost exclusively on the environmental. And if you're not including people as part of this process, then it's going to be difficult to really change things. But in terms of climate justice and how that differs from climate change, my understanding and perception of it is that the places that we're about to see hit hardest by climate change are not the ones that have necessarily contributed to it, whether because they haven't gone through the same industrialized process that we have, or are just responsible for generating less waste than some other larger nations or areas of the world. You also have to keep in mind that being able to pay attention to climate change is a relative privilege. And to be able to hold mental space and capacity to worry about that or strategize around the ways that your choices or the money you're spending or the politicians that you're voting for affect that requires the ability to be able to think of those things. And when you are more in day-to-day survival because of the income that is critical for you to make or the climate emergencies that you're already dealing with in the place that you live, then it becomes much harder to take on how to help contribute to stopping climate change.
Walk me through like the typical supply chain and how different people sort of play their role along the way to create a really good, transparent supply chain.
The way it works is individuals, which we refer to as collectors, pick up the plastic waste that might be from a landfill. It might be that they go around to their neighbors and pick up the plastic waste that they have that goes into our recycling network. Obviously, the sooner we can intercept it before it gets to a street or a canal or a landfill, the cleaner and higher quality it is. Those individuals bring the bottles that they've collected to collection centers. And these are all independently run small businesses across the country. The waste they bring is weighed, they're paid with cash per pound. That center separates the plastic and then we'll bring that to the recycling facility. At the recycling facility, the bottles are either baled and stored or go through a wash and grind line, which turns the bottles into this confetti, basically, this plastic confetti. Typically, then that's when it gets exported and goes to the US. And then it gets extruded further, melted into pellets so that it's a more uniform material. And by that point, you have essentially the same basic polymer as virgin polyester. You should be able to start utilizing that, whether it's in injection molding or blow molding or fiber for textiles, which is where we started.
So I would love to hear about how Haiti came into the mix and you decided that this was what you wanted to do and go down this social enterprise route.
Haiti became our starting point because our CEO went there following the 2010 earthquake and originally just to do relief work. But on that first trip, one of the first things that he wrote in his journal was, if Haiti could turn trash into money equals good. And that idea, essentially became the foundation for our business model. So by the time that I heard about it and was introduced to the idea for the business, it was already rooted in Haiti. And I knew very little about Haiti before then, and had not necessarily, planned on that being a country that I spent a ton of time in, or would work in, or have any professional involvement with. But it captured my heart really, really quickly. It's an easy place to fall in love with, and it is incredibly close to the U.S., which I don't think a lot of people necessarily realize. Yeah. Only about 700 miles from Florida.
I read that you were the first woman to run across the whole country. Is that true?
Yes. As far as we know.
First of all, how did that happen?
Yeah, completely accidentally. Well, I mean, not completely accidentally. It took a lot of training. But that was...
How far is it?
A little over 200 miles from north-south or the north coast to the south coast. And it was probably the craziest thing I've ever done, but also one of the most fun and rewarding experiences and adventures.
What conversations did you have with these people from Honduras and Taiwan and Haiti? And what did you learn?
Well, the culture around recycling is so different in each country. Taiwan has taught me way more about recycling. And it's an interesting case study in terms of a country's waste management, because when their government decided to really invest in recycling, they certainly put in municipal programs run by the various governments, but they also invested in this individual and private enterprise in recycling. So they took both approach because they wanted to, collect as much waste as possible. So in Taiwan, a lot of the centers that we're working with have been in this business for 30 years. They've been doing it twice as long as I have. Honduras is a little bit more mature than Haiti in terms of just recycling having been around. But I remember talking with our recycling facility partner, it's this great company called Invema. And the owner was telling us how when he first got started, he, told people that he would come and pay them if they would collect aluminum cans for him. He came back the following week and they didn't have any cans. And he said, why not? And they said, well, we thought you were kidding. Like, who's going to pay us for trash? And he's like, no, I will pay you. And then in Haiti, that was sort of our experience, especially once you started to get outside of Port-au-Prince, where the recycling facilities were out in the provinces. It just wasn't practiced or really heard of. I remember I was explaining that our company was going to buy it from the recycling facility and eventually help turn it into fabric. I'm doing this in like very broken French, and they're just kind of looking at me like I'm nuts.
Right.
But some members of the community were walking down the road and stopped and watched. This one man came over to me and he was like, did I just hear properly that you're going to take this plastic and turn it into fabric and people are going to make money for it? And I said, yeah, that's what we're trying to do. He like kind of lit up and he's like, when people learn that, their lives are going to change.
That's really
So you
sweet.
also get conversations like that where you're like, oh, we're on to something here. What I will say is there's so much pride in this work when we talk about like eco warriors or people fighting plastic pollution. Like these are the folks on the front lines. They are doing their real work every day. And I don't know that we necessarily know about them.
Right. I remember I read something that said that you believe recycling is magic, and true climate change heroes are entrepreneurs turning waste into resource every day.
Yep.
I think that was it. I couldn't agree more. One key thing that I would want to hear from you is how do I, Petrice Jones, living in Los Angeles, how do I do something about this, even as an average Joe?
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because there's plenty of things that we can do individually to lessen our footprint and impact on the world. But at the end of the day, the individual impacts that we're having are small in comparison to the industrial processes that are, really put into place.
Right.
You have to get a little bit smart about policy and what is out there and what's being proposed and who is voting for what, not only, of course, at the national level, but at your own local level or municipal level. And if you're not seeing anyone in those places talking about sustainability or climate change, then you should feel free to engage with them as one of their constituents and ask them why not. Just try to start driving the conversation. Then at the consumer level, brands take their cues from consumers. When we first started really engaging with brands in like 2014, 2015, we, would talk to the ones that were either already using recycled material and, were interested in the story, but not necessarily ready to like change their supply chains, which is fine. Or we talk to other brands that would say things like, well, we tried recycled a couple of years ago and it didn't really sell and our consumers aren't really asking for it. Then as I think the movement around ocean plastic has really picked up and consumers have become much more aware of just what a problem plastic pollution is. Now you have every huge brand in the world has this big commitment to utilizing a certain amount of recycled plastic by 2025 or 2030.
Everybody's picked these big goals out
Yep.
now, just to show that they're doing something, or at least they're saying something.
Yeah.
And that's great because it means we know what to hold entities accountable for. So obviously companies like you and HP and all these others are taking steps to solve these problems. So I want to know about what other companies can do to be more like you guys and how we get companies to start taking more responsibility for something that they get the most profit out of. And, I believe everything should come in equal parts in that sense. If you get the most out, you should be putting the most in. How do you suggest that we start to replicate models that you've created at First Mile and replicate what Hewlett-Packard has done?
I think in some ways it ties back to nonprofit versus corporate America. To HP's credit, they have just been a really bold and brave partner in saying we know the change that we can have by utilizing this material and driving demand. I think that the way we've had these industries separated, there are like the nonprofit charities over here, and they do all the good. They're responsible for that. And then there are the corporations over here, and their responsibility is solely to the shareholder and making them as much money as possible. A lot of these, corporations have CSR projects, foundations, or contribute in the charitable aspect of things. But what if they had the opportunity to tie that impact directly into their course of business? If they can start to find ways to creatively combine their foundations and their supply chains, or if they're looking at the corporate donations that they're giving and asking, how did we choose this cause and this charity? And what does this have to do with whatever product it is that we make? And if there isn't a really clear line there, then maybe reconsider how you could shift some of those resources back into your day-to-day course of business and operations, allowing you to become a more responsible company in that way. that's something brands can do and companies can do. From a consumer standpoint, I think, we liken the movement that we were trying to start in recycling with paying attention to social impact a lot to the food movement. So with people saying like, well, where did my food come from? How long did it travel to get here? What was the farm like? What was the name of the chicken? If you're doing that joke, but we really feel the same way, like, where did my stuff come from? That's just as important as what we're going to do with it or what I'm going to get out of these products once I own them. And I hope that as more and more consumers ask that question, brands realize that they have to be able to give an answer.
So consider the big picture every time you purchase something, which is difficult, especially for people in sort of survival mode or just trying to get through the day. That's where the corporate responsibility really comes in to make that decision to go, I'm going to do better by the people, because often people can't do better by themselves because their options are limited.
Yeah. And I think brands also, they have to weigh a gazillion different priorities. And I've also seen so many just get frozen at the aspect of sustainability because they'll want to start something and then realize like, oh, but we're not doing everything perfectly. And I think that there's a real call out culture in sustainability, which I don't think is necessarily the most effective thing, but it exists. And so I certainly understand their hesitation in that, but we don't have a way of producing things that creates no impact on the environment or socially. So if you're going to sit around and wait till things are perfect, then things are going to get really bad.
They'll
really
never
quick.
be there. Well, that's it, isn't it? Is that you're putting people into three different categories. It's the people who are doing great, and then there's the people who aren't great, and then there's the people who are trying to do better, and often they're the ones under the most fire, because I always say that we focus on progress, not perfection, because if you always want perfection, you'll never start, essentially. Yeah. And like you said, with this call-out culture, people are scared to take a step because they're going, oh, I've stopped using single-use plastic water bottles. They go, yeah, but you still eat chicken.
Right.
And they're like, yeah, I do, but I also stopped doing this.
Right.
And this is the thing that makes people shy away from it, because you're in a big group of people who don't care. There's a safety in numbers with the people who are doing a lot less. But yeah, so where are you guys at now? Obviously, COVID-19 has riddled the world and changed everything for a lot of people. How has it affected you guys?
Well, like you just said, it's affected everywhere in the world, so we're no exception. In Pittsburgh, the other half of our business is a direct-to-consumer brand called Day Owl that sells backpacks that utilizes, of course, first mile material. They have retooled the Pittsburgh space to be making face shields during this time for hospital systems, so creating extra personal protective equipment. And it's just been amazing to see. In March, we were fulfilling and distributing backpacks. And then in April, we were producing face shields. So it's just super inspiring to work with teams that agile and can respond to this is what's needed right now. And then obviously we work with a lot of apparel brands. And so retail has been hit really hard by this. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty in moving forward. The fashion and apparel industry is going to look very different at the end of this.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because like you said, everybody's taken a huge hit, and these fast fashion companies, not least of all, which is great. Frankly, I make no bones about it. I don't really, it's great to see, not to see people losing profit, but if people are losing profit, it means that less money is being made, which means less clothes are being made, which means less materials are being used, and we're treading more lightly. This is almost a golden opportunity for brands to do better, because, in my simple head, significantly easier when you have less demand. So what do you suggest for them? How do we get them to do better coming out the gate rather than reverting back to the old way of business as usual?
I think one of the reasons they've been so hard hit is because as consumers, we've been kind of trained to, know that there's always going to be something new, especially if you can get something from there that's already on sale, it'll be extremely cheap. So you don't have any qualms about getting a $5 going out top that you wear once and then decide you don't really like, or it falls apart after you wash it, or whatever happens to it. And no one's going out right now. So you don't need to, there's no need for a $5 going out top. The curtain's been pulled back just on that needless consumption. The rule of thumb that I know is floated in a lot of the sustainable fashion circles that I always try to follow is if you're not going to wear something at least 30 times, you don't buy it. Also, recycled materials still have a higher price point than virgin materials. And right now with, what we're seeing happening in the oil industry, that is going to be continuing for some time. So it's a very purposeful choice when a brand is going to switch to a higher cost material. And I would love to say that we'll eventually achieve price parity, but I just don't know if that will be true. Consumers will hopefully start to be a little bit more aware of what they're buying, and not just in terms of, do I like this and will I wear it 30 times, but also what are the impacts that's happening? Where did it come from? Textile chains and apparel chains are long. Most brands consider yarn a raw material, even though there's, of course, several production steps that happen before you get to yarn. So there's a lot of unknown, which is the reason that we got started in that industry. We wanted to be able to offer a very transparent supply chain from the actual raw material on the ground all the way through.
Well, if it makes you feel any better with your 30 wear philosophy, I've been wearing the same pair of sweatpants for approximately, it must be coming on like 83 days, something like that. So I'm really creating some balance in the world here.
For climate change.
Exactly. Yeah. You're welcome. Kelsey, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on and to interview you and to get an insight into all the incredible work that you're doing. I just want to firsthand just thank you for your work and for your efforts, because I know that doing things that are genuinely in service of the world is often the path less traveled and is often an underappreciated one. So it's just from me to you, thank you very much for everything that you do.
Absolutely. Would love to do it again. I'm thrilled with the work that Lonely Whale is doing and that we get to participate with it.
Hey listeners, just before you go, here's a quick ocean saving tip for you from our guest.
I would say at the consumer level, asking more and more questions of your brand. Where is this coming from? Are you using recycled material? If you are, where is that coming from? Would you consider either partnering with us or one of the other groups that exist in the world that are working on the front lines with the communities involved in collection? And the more demand we can drive for this material, the more value it will have, and it won't end up in our oceans.
Love what you're listening to? 52 Hertz is made possible by listener support like you. So go to loneywhale.org and support Season 2. Your donation helps amplify the voices of ocean advocates all around the world. Thank you. 52 Hertz is a podcast from Lonely Whale. Our show is produced by Emma Riley and Mindy Raymaker, with writing from Kirsten Stringer and audio engineering by James Riley. Special thanks to Young Hero, Emmy Kane, Kendall Starkman, and Danny Whitty. Subscribe to 52 Hertz wherever you get your podcasts. I've been your host, Petrice Jones. Thanks for listening. Until next time, tune in to 52 Hertz and tune out plastic.